This video is brought to you by life insurance. You can get in as little as 5 minutes by going to metkevin.com/life. Hey everyone, me Kevin here. The Hill is now reporting that the White House is considering vaccine mandates for air travel, aka vaccine passports. Dr. Fauci, in fact, has been quoted saying, "I would support that if you want to get on a plane and travel with other people, that you should be vaccinated." White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said on Thursday, quote, "We haven't taken options off the table, but I don't have any updates to share with you at this point. Our focus has been on the implementation of the big steps we announced last week." This was in response to specifically a question about vaccine mandates for air travel. Now, of course, she is referring to the big steps taken last week regarding vaccine mandates for companies with over 100 employees or testing requirements, as well as straight up vaccine mandates with no exception for testing for federal workers and federal contractors. Ron Klain, the chief of staff of the White House, said the same thing, but he doesn't believe that imposing such a mandate would be worth it at this point because it's much easier to impose a vaccine mandate on people's jobs, since once you're verified at work, you don't have to get re-verified versus every time you travel having to wait in longer lines to get verified. Now, right now, the airline industry does rely, at least in my opinion, on very stringent HEPA filtration requirements, which is a prong of COVID combating that I don't think the government has taken as seriously as they should. I think there are 3 real prongs to combating COVID. I do believe that vaccines are one way, especially for our at-risk populations. I do believe that high-quality masks like N95s are very good, especially, well, almost certainly valveless N95s are very good at preventing the transmission of COVID because you can protect yourself and others, especially in high-risk areas. But the one that I feel like our government is really failing at is HEPA filtration. Now, if we go to a restaurant and we're indoors, which is where a COVID cloud can build up, and we take our mask off to eat, well, and you can pass a COVID along or transmit COVID when you're vaccinated, as the University of Oxford told us about a month ago. Well, all of a sudden, vaccines aren't helping you in that case. Masks aren't helping you because you're not wearing it while you're eating, and you should focus on HEPA filtration or ventilation if the weather is appropriate, right? But this is a part of our government that's failing right now, is we're not having that dialogue about ventilation. Instead, we're having more of a dialogue about mandates. Now, obviously, a lot of people support more mandates, specifically those on the left. I mean, we just had an election essentially about COVID mandates in California, and we see that 70% of Californians are relatively pro-mandates. However, obviously, if you were to go to a state like Mississippi, which is much more red, you would have much more opposition to this. It's become a very politicized issue. And I do believe that part of the reason this issue has become so politicized is because our government is failing to realize that we could have proper HEPA filtration and ventilation as a third prong, and the government seems to be blind to this. The government and the CDC are also blind to the fact that most facial coverings suck and fail, whereas things like N95 respirators actually work. Problem is, those are a little bit expensive. Good news is we have plenty of them right now. Hospitals are back to one-time use for N95s because we have so many of them. But the other problem is if you had vaccine passports for air travel, you got to realize that right now you've only got about 65% of our population vaccinated. So that means you could potentially reduce airline travel by about 35% because 35% of individuals would not be able to travel by air unless, of course, they got vaccinated, which could potentially increase vaccinations, but certainly would hurt airlines in the meantime. Per The Hill, Delta Airlines does not see any immediate changes to COVID policies, so no vaccine mandates happening imminently. American Airlines indicated the same thing. But the big question now is, would it be legal? I mean, obviously there would be lawsuits galore over this, but in theory, the federal government could argue that they have the power to regulate interstate commerce via the Constitution, and therefore they could potentially institute a vaccine mandate. I mean, if we go back to 1824 via Gibbons versus Ogden, we know that the Supreme Court held that interstate activity can be regulated by the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. In Swift and Company versus the United States, this was a 1905 law, the Supreme Court argued that Congress had the authority to regulate local commerce as long as that commerce could become a part of the continuous current of commerce that involved interstate movement of goods and services. In English, even if you have local sort of air travel, let's say you're going from the bottom of California to the top of California, if this plane ride could potentially get infected with COVID and have implications of people potentially connecting to a different state, people could argue via Swift and Company versus the United States that the government does have the power to institute a vaccine mandate federally because they have the power to regulate interstate commerce. The Supreme Court has also held that regulating interstate commerce can be done for pretty much any reason as long as there is a, quote, substantial economic effect on interstate commerce, which obviously one could argue that spreading COVID has an economic effect, so the argument is there. Now, one side of the argument that could potentially go in favor of no kind of mandate is when we look at what happened in 2012 in the case of NFIB versus Sibelius. This was a 2012 case where the Supreme Court had to address the issue of the individual mandate in the Affordable Care Act. Remember Obamacare requiring everybody to get insurance? And here it was argued that, and the court ended up concluding, that requiring somebody to purchase health insurance is not under the power of the Commerce Clause, because basically doing nothing does not enable the government to force you to do something. And so this is potentially a hole where people who are anti-vaccine or mask mandate might be able to argue that, hey, me just traveling on a plane is in essence doing nothing, and therefore you can't compel me to do something. Just like you can't compel me to purchase health insurance, you can't compel me to get vaccinated or wear a mask. However, the counter argument to this could be that, well, by you traveling on a plane, potentially with COVID or without a vaccine or without a mask, you are in effect doing something. You are transmitting COVID, and thereby doing something, you are affecting commerce negatively, and thereby, by the Commerce Clause, we can regulate and require vaccine passports, right? So the arguments are present on both sides, and if anybody's going to do it, it would be Biden who would do it. I mean, we did just see a massive vaccine mandate imposed on all federal contractors and federal workers. I mean, this is just a straight up boom. Biden literally said, if you want to work with the federal government, you will be vaccinated. I mean, I could literally see him going as far as saying, if you want to travel, you will be vaccinated. It's intense, but is it possible? Yeah. Is it plausible? Maybe. I would put this personally at maybe a 25% chance of happening. That is, I wouldn't be surprised if it happens, but I think there's a greater chance of us not having a vaccine mandate for air travel, especially if our vaccination rates continue to trickle up. I would kind of expect the administration to say, let's see how many people get vaccinated now that Pfizer has FDA approval, and now that we have the federal vaccine mandate, let's see how many people get vaccinated, give it a few months. But I wouldn't be surprised if right now we're September 19th, if we go towards Halloween and COVID cases are starting to spike again because we're getting into cooler winter months outside of those hot summer months where the Sunbelt states really saw a COVID surge, and then all of a sudden we see a pickup in COVID again during the winter, then yeah, I wouldn't put it past the Biden administration to require vaccines for air travel, especially during the winter. Potentially, they might say something like, hey, if you have a plane landing or taking off from a particular area that has COVID case counts above a certain requirement, then potentially they would require those sorts of vaccine mandates. Keep in mind, it's not just the Commerce Clause, by the way, that the federal government has. They've got a lot of powers. Another power specifically that the federal government could take advantage of is basically... See, look, there's something called the spending clause, and it's basically the government's way of providing money to states. And through the spending clause, Congress essentially incentivizes states to do certain things the way Congress wants them to act. And as long as they do certain things a certain way, then Congress provides them funding. So they could, in theory, threaten to remove that kind of funding unless states work to enforce things like a vaccine or mask mandate, especially for interstate commerce travel. Now, the flip side is, okay, well, that's fine, but, if they take away money from the states, then, yeah, I mean, maybe the states would come in to regulate, but would it even be up to the states to regulate? Since airports are really ports of entry, could we just use the TSA or Homeland Security workers to enforce these sorts of vaccine mandates? Yeah, probably. So you probably wouldn't have to go in the direction of using the spending clause, probably be more of a commerce clause along with federal agencies at airports to regulate this sort of thing. So, yeah, I mean, could it happen? Totally. And quite frankly, I mean, based on the reading of the Constitution and case law, I venture to say that the power is probably in favor of the Biden administration, certainly long enough to get us through the next COVID winter, so to speak, before something like this could actually be litigated in our Supreme Court, just as an example. So I would say this is entirely possible, but again, I think it's less than 25% likely. But again, wouldn't surprise me if it happened, especially if case counts went up. So my thoughts on this, hopefully this was insightful for you. If it was, consider subscribing to the channel, and folks, we'll see you in the next video. Thanks so much, and if any of this stresses you out, get life insurance in as little as 5 minutes by going to metkevin.com/life.